For me, yes. How long will it take for me to grade? Typically the next day. I've been feeling a bit under the weather, so I'm a bit slower right now. It'll be done by Friday probably. I try to get back real quick. We'll always go over the quiz and practical. So on Monday, we'll go over the answers, and you get to keep your quizzes because I want you to study from them and learn from them. So yeah, look forward to that. Any other questions? Cool? Cool. There's a seat up here if anyone wants to sit closer. I don't have any assigned seating here unless you requested to sit up front closer, but I know this isn't the best setup, so if you want to sit up closer, there's a seat. Okay, so we were talking about epithelial. We just started talking about epithelial tissue, about the different organization and structures of epithelial tissue. When we name epithelial tissue, there are two names we give to them. What are those two names, like categories, I guess? Or let me back up. What's an example of a type of epithelium? Okay, well, that's one example. Simple or stratified, so in other words, number of layers. Who can tell me another one? Cuboidal, and so what's that describing? Shape. All right, so layers and shape. Those are the general ways in which we describe types of epithelium. So we left off on slide. We'll start with 16. Slide 16. We'll go over all the different types of epithelium. The first type here is simple squamous. Simple means one layer. Squamous, what does that mean? Flat. One layer of thin, flat cells. So if you look at it from a longitudinal view, they look like this. Here's the nucleus in the center. This is a longitudinal view. If you look at it top down, a cross-sectional view, they look like pancakes or eggs or something. They're thin and flat. Why do we want, in what situation would we want a thin layer of flat cells? By having very flat cells, it doesn't take much time to cross that layer. So it's great for diffusion. The word diffusion, that means when molecules pass from one area to another, just like when a ball rolls down a hill, it doesn't have to do anything, it just rolls. When things diffuse, they don't have to do anything, they just move and diffuse around. Well, we're not going to get into concentration gradients, but anyways, where do you find these cells? Where do we want fast absorption and secretion? Two basic important places that I want you to know for now. The lining of body cavities. What structure lines certain cavities that limits friction? Like our stomach and lungs, what was it called? Serous, like generally serous membranes. Serous membranes, the outer layer, the superficial layer of serous membranes is simple squamous epithelium. So the pericardial membrane, the pleural membrane, the peritoneal membrane, they're all made from simple squamous. Sorry? Are both sides? Yeah, both sides of the membranes, parietal and visceral. Blood vessels and your lungs are also lined with simple squamous. And I should add one more that you looked at in lab. Whether we're talking about blood vessels or lungs or even a certain part of the kidney, which we looked at, remember that circular thing in the kidney where we saw those thin, flat cells? Well, let's talk about a blood vessel. Let's say this is a capillary. Why would we want thin, flat cells thin flat cells for a capillary. What happens with capillaries? Does anyone know? Blood's flowing through it, but as blood flows through it, what's also happening? We're exchanging stuff. We're exchanging nutrients, we're exchanging oxygen, we're exchanging wastes. You want that to happen quickly. So that's why blood vessels are lined with a thin, flat layer of cells. Same with lungs. What are you exchanging? Air, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And then in the kidney, you're exchanging, you're trying to get rid of waste, so for filtration. So you need thin, flat cells either for reducing friction in cavities or for exchanging stuff, whether it's oxygen, carbon dioxide, wastes, nutrients, whatever. Questions on simple squamous? Stratified squamous. I should give myself more room here. Stratified squamous, it's many layers. Stratum means layer. And we talked about how this comes in two varieties, keratinized and non-keratinized. Let's talk about non-keratinized first. Or I guess we'll talk about both. Keratin is a protein. Keratin is a protein. So cells make this protein. And if cells make this protein, that makes those cells more waterproof and tougher. So you can feel how relatively the texture of your skin is fairly tough. But if you were to do the same thing on the inside of your cheek, it wouldn't feel as good and you might damage your inner lining. The skin is different from the inner linings. The inner linings of your mouth, your esophagus, digestive system, respiratory system, reproductive system, those linings are called mucous membranes. We've talked about serous membranes. This is different. Mucous membranes are something else. We'll talk about in more detail what that means, but they're more delicate to start, and they're covered with mucus, as the name suggests. You find non-keratinized stratified squamous lining mucous membranes. Keratinized stratified squamous, that's your skin. And your skin needs to be tough and waterproofed. What's true about both of them is that the outermost layers, the superficial layers, are dead. You want dead layers of skin cells so that, because there's so much friction and you're exposed to different things, you want them to be protective, like scales that you can just get rid of in case of damage. Which means what process happens in these this type of epithelium very often? Mitosis, yeah. We've got mitosis happening in the deeper layers. Notice how much darker this is. What's the term, the property of epithelium that describes why they're also clustered together? Cellularity. We know we're looking at epithelium, and this is different because it's so much darker here. And what makes it darker? Physically, the nuclei. The nuclei. Nuclei is plural of nucleus. Just so you can see a difference here again, this is, we're going to get used to this. This is non-keratinized. This is keratinized. One difference here, you can see on the superficial layer how much flakier it is. This dry, flaky layer helps prevent water and other things from coming in. So there's more dead layers on a keratinized stratified squamous. Another word for skin is cutaneous membrane. So now we've mentioned 3 different types of membranes in our body. There is serous membranes, mucous membranes, and cutaneous membranes. we'll talk in more depth of these later, but I just want to introduce these terms to you now. They'll be important. Questions on the difference between, oh, and what's shown up here. Here's a single skin cell, and highlighted here in green, this is using a special fluorescent dye, highlighted here in green is keratin protein. Keratin protein gets intertwined with the cytoskeleton and just supports the entire thing. So you have keratin all throughout each cell, and you have keratin even out secreted to the outside of the cell. So it's just this keratin is supporting these cells to make them stronger and more waterproofed.
Is it more common in the outer layers?
Is it more common in the outer layers? Yes, it is more common in the outer layers. When we start talking about skin, we'll see that when they're born, they're not making keratin yet, and as they move up and get older, they start making more keratin. Yes. Cool. All right. So that's simple squamous and stratified squamous. Now we're getting to a different shape. This is simple cuboidal. As the name suggests, it's one layer of cube-shaped cells. So, like that. Nucleus in the center. So whether you do a cross-section or a longitudinal section of these, they're going to look the same because three-dimensionally they're roughly the same. So here's an example of a tubule found in a kidney. Different glands have simple cuboidal cells. By being a single layer, that's generally good for absorption. By being cuboidal, that means there's more volume in the cell. If there's more room in the cell, what can you hold more of? What can you have more of? You have more water, yes, but also more cytosol is the watery stuff. It's also in the cytosol. More organelles, that's what I'm looking for. Thank you. Organelles. You have more cytosol and more organelles. You have more stuff. And if you have more organelles, that means you can produce more things. That's what secretions are. Secretions are things that cells produce and release to the outside. How do they release them, generally? Lysosomes for breaking things down. Vesicles, they use vesicles, and what's the process of using a vesicle to release stuff? Exocytosis, yeah. Right, so by having a larger cell, they can produce more. Simple squamous or any squamous cell, they don't produce as much as cuboidal. So many different glands, like endocrine and exocrine glands. If you don't know what those terms mean, don't worry, we'll get to what that means later. But things that produce hormones, like the thyroid gland, things that produce secretions, like the salivary gland, they have simple cuboidal cells. For those of you that looked at the kidney, hopefully you all did, that looked at the kidney for the simple squamous cells, the simple squamous were only in those very thin circular areas, but everywhere else were pretty much cuboidal. Hopefully you can remember back to what they look like. There are a bunch of circles with cube cells. Again, for secreting, we'll learn about how the kidney not just filters, but also secretes and absorbs. It does all those different things. Questions on simple cuboidal? Okay. Stratified cuboidal is not as common. When we saw stratified squamous, there was often a ton of layers, like 5 or more, 5 to 10 or even more. I don't really know how many. When we see stratified cuboidal, there's usually only 2 layers, 2 to 3, so not a whole lot. And they generally form a tube of some kind. So in other words, they're forming ducts. I'm getting tired of drawing these. All right. They're generally forming ducts. A duct is a passageway for in this case, fluids. So shown here, here's a duct. So when we talk about sweat glands or mammary glands, the glands that release milk, or salivary glands, one secretes saliva in our mouths. These are lining the ducts for secretions. By having more than one layer, that's protective. By having large cells, that allows for secretion. So it's both protective and allows for secretions. It's not as common. Questions? Yes.
Is there, like, how do they know to, like, make, like, a hole in the middle where they come together?
How do they know how to make a hole in the middle? That's a great question. I don't know if I can answer that easily. Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that easily. That's a developmental question. All right, next shape is simple columnar. Simple columnar, you have one layer of columnar cells, so they're taller. Columnar and cuboidal are very similar. They're both bigger cells, bigger than squamous. So in that sense, they're both great for producing stuff. They're great for secretions. So when we start learning where the different columnar cells are, it's really just have to memorize these are areas where you find cuboidal, these are areas where you find columnar, because they do very similar things. By being larger, they can produce more stuff. Typically, where we find columnar cells are in the digestive system and the reproductive system. So lining your stomach, lining your intestines, lining the uterine tubes, you can find simple columnar. So in the digestive system, it's great for secreting, but also by being a single layer, you can also absorb. We obviously want to absorb things in our intestines, for instance. Also, remember we talked about cilia and microvilli and stereocilia, those apical adaptations? They're typically found on simple columnar, typically. There's one exception, we'll get to that in a minute. So for example, microvilli are found in the intestines on the apical side. Cilia are found in the uterine tubes on the apical side. Questions on simple columnar? Stratified columnar, also not as common like stratified cuboidal. So again, it's just more than one layer, usually only two. You don't have many layers stacked on top, like 2 to 3 layers. You find this in not many places. By being layered, they allow for protection, and by being larger, they can produce secretions. So it's certain ducts also. So stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar can be lining ducts of glands. Certain high friction areas like the pharynx, anus, and the urethra, you can find it in parts of it. Most of the pharynx and most of the anus and most of the urethra, what are they actually? What are they mostly? What type of epithelium? Not simple. Stratified. Most of the pharynx, the back of your throat, most of the anus and most of the urethra are stratified squamous, but there are parts of it that are stratified columnar. All right, we've run out of what's the word? We've got simple and stratified squamous, simple and stratified cuboidal, simple and stratified columnar. Now we're getting to the odd ones. This one is a fun name. It is called pseudo, the P is silent, pseudo stratified columnar. What that means, pseudo means false or fake, like pseudoscience. They're still columnar, but they look like they're multiple layers. They look like they're multiple layers because all the nuclei are not lined up. You've got a nucleus here, and a nucleus here, and a nucleus here. They're all over the place. And they're often actually kind of, they're columnar-ish, but they're usually kind of oblong or slanted or whatever. So that's why they're called pseudo-stratified. They look like they're more than one layer, but it's really just one layer. Where do you find this? The trachea is a major place that we'll be looking at. The trachea is is your windpipe, the main airway leading to your lungs. The one with those cartilage rings around it. They're pseudostratified and they have cilia. So here's another example where you can have cilia for sweeping things. Your trachea, the back of your nasal cavity, your bronchi, which is branches off of the trachea, they all are ciliated pseudostratified columnar. In many areas of the reproductive system, whether it's male reproductive, epididymis and vas deferens, or the female reproductive, endometrium, superficial layer of the uterus, those are also pseudostratified columnar. They're not necessarily ciliated though. Like the endometrium is not ciliated, but it is pseudostratified columnar. All right, one more epithelium type. This is transitional. What transitional means is that for most of these epithelium types, the layers are very distinct. Like here's one layer, here's the next, here's the next, here's the next. Here, the layers are not very distinct. Like you've got one cell here, one cell is cuboidal, another cell here is columnar, so it goes down another level. And it's all just kind of piecemeal of differently shaped cells. So you can't see any actual layers going on. It's all just all over the place. These are only found in very specific areas. You only find this type in the urinary tract, in parts of the urinary tract. So starting with a part of the kidney going down to the bladder, urinary bladder, to the ureter, from parts of the kidney to the ureter to the urinary bladder. There we go. That's the only places where you find transitional. The benefit here is that by having layers that are uneven, you can have a relaxed state. You can see how the cells are one shape. If you put pressure on them, they can compress and stretch out. And if in your urinary tract, you're going to have a lot of fluids coming through all the time, fluid's going to be pushing up on the tubes or on the bladder, it allows for stretch without damage. That's where you find transitional epithelium. Questions on that? Okay. Take a moment. I should clarify which of the ones listed is best, because there could be more than one answer. Raise your hand if you need more time. Okay, let's see your hands. 1, 2, 3. Real quick, talk to your neighbors. Find someone with a different answer. Go ahead. All right, one more time, please. Hands on 3. 1, 2, 3. On 3, say the letter. 1, 2, 3. C. Great, yeah. Simple is always best for absorbing, but if you also want to secrete, then you need something like cuboidal or columnar. Columnar is not listed, so simple cuboidal is the best answer here. Most of your endocrine glands are simple cuboidal. Endocrine glands are glands that produce hormones and release stuff to the outside, to your bloodstream. Here's another question. Raise your hand if you need more time. More seconds. All right, hands on 3. 1, 2, 3. On 3, say the letter. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, the esophagus is not for digesting or absorbing food. It's allowing this bolus of food to travel down to the stomach where more things can happen. A is the best answer. Okay, we will continue this a little bit in lab, so I'll see you then, whether it's today or tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. I'll, see you in a bit.